Welcome back, adventurers. Today we're talking about those wet, beautiful, snaking, and winding highways that make up the veins of our worlds. That's right, we're talking about rivers. Now, rivers might look random, but they actually form through a combination of forces like terrain, climate, and erosion, to name a few. And a river's shape, size, and direction all stem from the unique landscape that it carves through, influenced by everything from mountain slopes to rainfall. But before you actually start to draw those river lines, it's important to understand them a little first. So let's dive in. Sorry, there's probably going to be more puns. There are a few different types of rivers, and they're important to understand. So first of all, you have youthful rivers, and these are fast, narrow, and steep. These rivers are actually carving deep channels in the earth, and they're often found near mountains. They create these really rugged terrains that are perfect for a sort of wild landscape. Then there's your mature rivers, which are slower and broader. These rivers have had time to wind and settle, and they actually form rich floodplains, which would be an ideal type of river for villages and farming communities. And then there's old rivers, which are wide, winding, and slow. And usually they create sweeping curves and marshy areas. So swamps, old mystical regions, things like that. Then there's your seasonal rivers, which flow only during certain times of the seasons, hence the name, and will usually show up when there's rain or snowmelt, and then they'll dry up. So these kinds of rivers can create some pretty dynamic features on a world's climate. And then there's braided rivers, which are these really cool looking tangled crisscrossing channels that usually develop on sediment heavy areas, which is why they actually break up, because all of the dirt and sediment just sort of piles up and actually forces them to break, but they do eventually come back together. And then the next thing you want to understand about rivers is how they change based on where they are in terms of elevation and location and more. Rivers aren't static, they change and they move through a landscape, because they are always looking for the path of least resistance, trying to flow from a higher elevation to a lower elevation, sea level, right? So at higher elevations, rivers are usually fast, steep, and narrow, right? They're kind of pointed down a mountain. At mid-elevation areas, rivers start to slow down and they actually broaden, especially if they're moving into flatter terrains. And this is where they actually start to kind of wind and meander, which you can see in rivers like these. And they start to get their sort of typical S shape. And then at lower elevations, the rivers have had time to reach lower parts of the land. They become wide, they become slow, and they start to deposit all the stuff that they have carried from higher elevations into the lower areas. So you can see how, depending on where the river is located, or at what elevation, I guess you could say, will create not only a different landscape, but a different way of using the river's natural resources. And then you can also consider how big the town is that might be built on these rivers, right? So a small town in smaller villages, they're probably the heart of daily life. They provide the drinking water, they help with irrigation, but then sometimes, unfortunately, they also will become a restroom, because that's just something that pre-modern societies did. They didn't always have access to infrastructure to separate waste from water, right? And so you can see how that creates issues with like disease and water quality and conflicts over clean water access. So considering how a river might just be used in daily life can become a source of tension between settlements downstream, which we can use as world builders as part of our storytelling. Now, the land around rivers is often some of the most fertile due to the regular flooding and, the rivers depositing nutrient-rich silt onto banks. So these floodplains around the rivers tend to be perfect for farming, making rivers critical for agriculture. So if you're designing a town or a city by a river, think about how it's going to sustain the crops and how it'll shape the economy around the town. Towns built around fertile rivers could become breadbaskets and feed entire kingdoms, which, then could make them become targets for invasion by enemies. So just taking into consideration how a river might react with the land around it and how different civilizations might be using that river and its resources can actually fuel some of the stories that you're trying to tell. As a river reaches the end of its journey, they will split up into multiple channels, forming what's called a delta. And deltas are usually swampy or marshy, wet, complex waterways that are rich in wildlife and vegetation, and these areas can be really prime spots for trade. And so that mix of fresh and salt water can create these really cool ecosystems. And then some rivers will actually, especially near the coast, form what's called a barrier island, where a lot of that sediment gets pushed out into the ocean in large quantities and then will just build up and create these really crazy looking islands. And then when you think about how rivers could also play a role in spiritual or magical aspects of your world, like having sacred rivers or magic rivers, you can really start to just create a very unique sort of landscape just around these river systems. Now, when you're actually drawing the rivers, there's some things to keep in mind, right? You want to make sure that there's a consistency to the flow. Rivers usually will start narrow and fast at high elevations, so closer to the mountains, you'll want to keep them a little straighter, and then as they go lower to the ground, so you as a world builder in your head will look at the map and decide, where the hills begin and where they stop. But you can sort of use that as a natural flow when drawing them and start to make them snake a little more as they get farther and farther away from the mountains. And then all smaller streams should collect into one river and flow into another, right? So like I said before, rivers will follow a path of least resistance. So when you're looking at how the river is moving, remember to consider that there's always going to be an end point, and that all these other little streams will flow into a river, and that main river is going to flow to the lowest point possible and will follow the path of least resistance there. Now, looking at my actual map, taking a look at the first rivers I drew, you can see that I was originally going left to right, and something about it just felt off to me when I was comparing to the reference maps that I was using. So after everything we have just learned through my 100% accurate, not even a slight chance of error information about rivers, let's consider a few things. If all rivers flow to the lowest point and follow the path of least resistance, I had to take a look at my mountain ranges, right? And mountain ranges are going to naturally create a sort of bowl, and all water is going to want to move towards that area. And these areas are actually called watersheds. Now, when you take a look at a map of the US, for example, you can see how rivers flow towards specific areas into bigger rivers, and what makes those areas is actually a difference in elevation, because when you look at a map, you can see here are the Sierras, here are the Rockies, and here are the Appalachians. Now, notice how the rivers are moving away from those areas, and almost all rivers in this area move into the Mississippi because it's a lower area. And so all of these smaller rivers follow the path of least resistance away from the mountain to that specific spot, like a funnel. You can even see the line, and they collect water from all these other little rivers called tributaries. So now I have to try to envision that on my own map. So I reference my tectonic plates, I look at my mountains, and I actually erase and I start to redraw. I actually redrew it a few times and just sort of let my eyes tell me if it felt right when I compared it to the maps that I was using as reference. Now I had the issue where some areas needed to have a river because of lore reasons, specifically this area in the north. And so where a river might act in a particular way, such as heading towards the center, which I didn't want in this case, I added hills to make the river go to the direction I wanted it to, right? Just using elevation to redirect the river. Now, from an actual drawing perspective, what I did was pick a spot for the river to begin. It might be coming from an underwater cave or spilling out as a trickle through the rocks heading down it, or it might be a lake or a mountain that's collecting rainwater super high up. But whatever it is, that's point A. Now you just have to figure out where point B is, where the place the river ends is, by figuring out where the lowest and easiest place to reach for it would be. All other rivers in the area should theoretically want to head in that direction, and they're going to hitch a ride on a bigger river to get there and eventually flow into a main river that goes to that point. So all these little rivers that start up high will flow into a bigger one, making it swell, which I tried to show by bolding the lines, right? And then that newer river will flow around hills and rocks, and as they get further away from the mountains and start to slow and meander and curve and back and forth and flow into a bigger one. Now, the reason they curve is actually really fascinating, and that snaking shape is just an inherent part of how rivers work, because eventually they'll hit a wall as water is flowing and move to the left or right, depending on what is a lower elevation, and find and carve a new way down until they hit another wall where they will then snake back the other way. And eventually, over time, this sort of zigzagging shape becomes more of a curve. But now I'm just nerding out. Now, you just sort of do this over and over, where a smaller river flows into a bigger river, and a bigger river flows into an even bigger river, and just do the exact same thing. Figure out what the lowest point is, where they're going to flow, and where all of them will converge to flow out to a sea or an ocean. Once you really start to design it and think about all these little things, it starts to look like a system of veins, because all these little rivers start somewhere else, flow into the lower area that becomes a bigger river, and the big river is trying to flow to an even lower area, which is the main watershed where all the other water in the area is flowing, and that becomes an even bigger river and eventually spills out to sea. So you can see that what I did is change the direction of the river, because I felt that the main river, with so many mountains around, would flow away from the mountains toward the lowest area, which on my map would just be the south. the farthest spot away from any mountain range, and so all rivers would feed to that one. And now, because I have made these little considerations, there's this brand new river system in my world that was never there on the original map, and you just rinse and repeat, asking yourself the same questions on every side of your mountain ranges. Where does the river start? Where would it most naturally end? What shape does it take along the way? And what smaller rivers would flow into that one? And there you have it. That's kind of a quick crash course on rivers. I hope it helps. Obviously, this isn't perfect. I'm sure there are imperfections, and some river expert out there is going to correct me in the comments. But compared to my original map, this is a huge improvement, and I'm honestly pretty proud of it. Let me know in the comments down below what you do to plot your rivers, since, after all, this is fantasy map making, and rivers could move in some really unique and interesting ways. Thank you so much for watching. Forge on, my friends, and we'll see you next time, adventurers.